Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to ISS. I'm Ben Barry, the Senior Fellow for Land Warfare, and we have with us Professor Gregory Gause from the University of Vermont, who's also non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Doha Center and a real expert on the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. Of course, in both areas, we've seen a decade of conflict and destabilization. Not only the US and coalition invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq, but as a result of the so-called Arab Spring, conflict has increased throughout the region, and we see the consequences of Syria, which has become a net exporter of instability, including back into Iraq, Lebanon. We see a conflict in Yemen, and we've even seen civil conflict in Bahrain. Now, those all clearly have their unique dynamics flowing from their local circumstances, but we can also see them as part of a larger conflict across the Middle East as a whole, where you've got regional powers in the Middle East, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar and the UAE, who are attempting to advance their interests and check their regional rivals. Now, sectarianism quite clearly contributes to this, but you can see elements of an old-fashioned power context, particularly played out against the domestic situation inside weaker states in the region. And there's no one better than Professor Gause to discuss it, which he's going to do now. He'll talk for about half an hour, and then we'll take questions and interventions from the floor. Professor.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming out. It's a pleasure to be back in London and a pleasure to be at the IISS. I only have a half an hour, and when you're a college professor, that's a very, very short amount of time. So I'm going to dispense with the normal thanks to everybody and jump right in. I would say that Saudi Arabia is losing what I call the new Middle East Cold War. And as Mr. Barry said, I see this very much as a classic geopolitical balance of power conflict in which sectarianism plays a role, but is not the lens through which we should understand this conflict. And I'm happy to get into that in questions if you're interested. But I think that the Saudis know that they're losing the new Middle East Cold War. This is not a recent phenomenon. It predates the Arab uprisings of 2011. I think that the real beginnings of the new Middle East Cold War were in 2003 when the United States, with some allies, I think Britain was one of them, invaded Iraq. That was a joke. I know Britain was one of them. And thank you for your help. What the Iraq invasion did was open up a new arena for competition among the regional powers for influence. And in this new Middle East Cold War, the real contest of influence is played out in the domestic politics of weak Arab states, as Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, other players attempt to support clients and allies in internal fights in the domestic politics of Lebanon, of Iraq, of the Palestinian Authority, and now of Syria, in order to try to push politics in a certain direction. This is very much reminiscent, I think, of what the late Malcolm Kerr referred to as the Arab Cold War of the 1950s and 60s, and what the late Patrick Seale, who just died last month, one of I think the great interpreters and certainly most fascinating interpreters of the Middle East to the West, called the struggle for Syria, right, back in the 50s and into the 60s. Right? So the Saudis are losing. Why are they losing? Right? How do we know they're losing? Well, they're losing in Lebanon, right, where the Saudis went very strongly in for the March 14th coalition in the aftermath of former Prime Minister Hariri's assassination, and have been unable to dislodge Hezbollah, Iran's ally, as the most important player in Lebanese politics. In Palestine, the Saudis, with great publicity, negotiated a deal between Fatah and Hamas back in 2007 in Mecca itself, with King Abdullah personally involved. Right? Within a half a year, that had fallen apart. And Hamas had taken over Gaza, Fatah the West Bank, and Hamas had consolidated its relationship with Iran. In Iraq, the Saudis competed with the Iranians. The Saudis were kind of stuck at the beginning in Iraq. They could not really patronize their natural allies in the Sunni community because their natural allies in the Sunni community were shooting at their other allies, the United States. Finally, with the rise of the Sahwa, the awakening movement in Iraq, the Saudis found an ally, right? Sunni, anti-Iranian, and not shooting at the Americans, shooting with the Americans. And so the Saudis patronized that, but the Saudis also attempted to patronize in the political process Iyad Allawi, who of course achieved a plurality in the 2010 Iraqi elections, but was unable to unseat Nouri al-Maliki, who through Iranian negotiation and intervention was able to put together a coalition to remain in power. So when the Arab Spring hits, the Saudis had been on a losing streak, losing in Lebanon, losing in Palestine, losing in Iraq. And the Arab Spring seemed to suggest that the Saudis were going to lose in a number of other places as well. Most immediately, they lost their most important Arab ally in Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, or at least they feared that they had lost Egypt. And the Saudis had been unable to convert their best chance for rolling back Iranian influence, that is to say in Syria, into a geopolitical victory. This is not to say that the Saudis didn't have some successes in the Arab Spring period. They were able to shore up their fellow monarchs with money, in the case of Jordan, and to a lesser extent Morocco, with money in the case of Oman, with money and symbolic military support in Bahrain, which was the most serious challenge to Saudi dominance of the Arab side of the Gulf. And they also reasserted their leading role in Yemen in the negotiation process to transition from Ali Abdullah Saleh to the current president, Abdurrabbu Mansur Hadi. But it's Syria that has become, for the Saudis, right, the crucial arena of the post-Arab Spring contest for influence with Iran. Syria appeared to be Saudi Arabia's best opportunity to roll back Iranian influence in the Eastern Arab world. Sunni majority population, a government that clearly had lost the confidence and support of the majority of its population, at a time when it appeared that the dominoes were falling in Republican regimes throughout the Arab world. So the failure of the Saudis to be able to convert that possibility of overturning the Assad government has, I think, been their most serious defeat in the post-Arab Spring contest for influence that I'm calling this new Middle East Cold War. Given that, it's extremely puzzling that the Saudis have chosen in the past months to open up a second front in this new Middle East Cold War. And that is their current campaign, right, joined with the United Arab Emirates and the new government in Cairo, against the Muslim Brotherhood. And we know what the characteristic of this campaign is. It's financial and political support for the post-military coup government in Cairo, and for General Sisi in particular. It's pressure on Qatar to end Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood and other things that the Saudis don't like about what Qatar is doing in the Middle East. And it's its own declaration, Saudi Arabia's own declaration, that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist group. This I found a particularly un-Saudi thing to do. The history of Saudi foreign policy is basically not to shut any door that you don't have to shut, to leave yourself a bridge back to current opponents who might one day be people that you want to talk to. this very definitive action of declaring not a specific country organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, even the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, but declaring the Brothers as a whole a terrorist organization, I thought was very uncharacteristic of past patterns in Saudi policy. So why would, in the face of the pressures that the Saudis have felt from what I would call their losing streak in the new Middle East Cold War, why would they open up this second front? Part of it obviously is regional foreign policy. The Saudis were uncomfortable with the Brotherhood government in Egypt, were uncertain of its foreign policy inclinations. But I doubt that that's the main reason. I doubt that that's the main reason. What, in fact, did the Morsi government do in terms of foreign policy when it was in power? Did it ally itself with Iran? No, it didn't. Morsi did visit Tehran, but while he was there, he publicly lectured the Iranians on the error of their ways in their Syrian policy. And then Morsi came home to Cairo and in effect encouraged Sunni Muslims to go and fight in Syria against the Assad government. I think that the more important reason for why the Saudis have declared war on the Muslim Brotherhood and opened up this second front in the new Middle East Cold War is because of the long-term domestic implications of Muslim Brotherhood electoral victories in the Arab world. Now, I want to make myself clear here. I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia itself is any threat to the stability of the regime. Right? The Brotherhood is not a particularly widespread organization in Saudi Arabia. Part of the deal way back in the 1960s, right, when the Saudis accepted a number of the Egyptian brothers who were driven out by the Nasser dictatorship, was that the brothers would not explicitly organize in Saudi Arabia. And I think by and large, the brothers kept that promise, although obviously they had a political impact on Saudis that they ran into in the education system and in just normal everyday life. So I don't think that the Saudis see the brothers as an immediate threat to domestic security and stability at home. But I think that the idea of elected Islamist governments in the Sunni Muslim world is a long-term challenge for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, for decades, right, could reasonably put itself forward to the world as the spokesman for Islam. Then after the Iranian Revolution, they had a competitor on that side. But the Saudis could say, well, that's the minoritarians. That's the Shia. We are the spokesman for Sunni Islam, the vast majority of the Muslim world. But if you get elected Islamist governments in the Sunni Muslim world, particularly in the Arab world closest to Saudi Arabia, the Saudis could not credibly put forward the claim to speak for Islam, for Sunni Islam, to the world. Also, the very idea of elected Islamist governments is a long-term threat, not an immediate threat, but a long-term threat to the particular Saudi authoritarian political system. In many ways, I think the more serious problem for the Saudis than Muslim Brotherhood victories is the fact that Salafis have run in a number of elections, most importantly in Egypt, where they won 20% of the seats in the parliament that was then suspended by the Egyptian Supreme Court. The Saudis had always claimed, right, that their view of Islam, the real Islam in their view, doesn't require democracy. It's fine for other countries, that's fine. But here, in a country governed with the real Islam, the true Islam, we don't need these elections. In fact, these elections might be very dangerous because it would imply that human beings are the legislators, not God. This has been the standard Salafi position for quite a while. It's an ideological position, if you will, that united for a while, right, the whole spectrum of Salafi political thought, from the Saudis themselves all the way over to Sayyid Qutb. But slowly but surely, right, that Salafi consensus against democratic politics has been chipped away at. It's been chipped away at in the Gulf itself, with Salafis participating actively and openly in Kuwaiti political campaigns, in Bahraini parliamentary elections. But I would contend that the fact that Egyptian Salafis immediately and enthusiastically joined the new political process and successfully ran a whole lot of candidates for parliament was probably a shocking event for the Saudis. Now, if you talk to Egyptians, they would say, what do you mean shocking? The Saudis funded these guys. And I don't deny that. I doubt the Saudi government financed them, but certainly private sources in Saudi Arabia were important sources of funding for the Noor Party in Egypt. But the reaction in Saudi Arabia to this was very interesting. Right? You had prominent Saudi political figures identified with at least part of the Salafi movement in Saudi Arabia, like Salman al-Oda, openly supporting the Egyptian elections, openly supporting the revolt against Mubarak, in direct contradiction to Saudi government policy. You had Saudi Salafis signing petitions in 2011 calling for an elected Majlis al-Shura, consultative council in Saudi Arabia itself. So while the focus in the Saudi reaction of these past few months has been against the Muslim Brotherhood, I would say probably the more serious issue that the Saudis will have to face down the road is the prospect, and we will see if it continues to develop, of a growing number of Salafis engaged in democratic politics. In any event, in the short term, right, the Sisi coup and the turfing out of the Muslim Brotherhood government in Egypt, I think, is a short-term success for Saudi foreign policy. And they're following it up with this pressure on Qatar and with their own domestic moves against the brothers. How does this fit into Saudi Arabia's most important international relationship, that is to say with the United States? Well, as you probably know from reading the papers, things aren't all that great between Washington and Riyadh. I'm not of the school that says that the bilateral relationship is in a serious crisis. I'm old enough to remember the oil embargo of 1973. And all of you in this room are old enough to remember the post-9/11 tensions between Saudi Arabia and the United States. I don't think that the current situation, excuse me, rises to that level of problems in the bilateral relationship. But there are certainly serious differences of viewpoint about the direction of politics in the Middle East. I would characterize them as follows. The United States and Saudi Arabia, I think, share an ultimate goal vis-a-vis Iran, right? The country that, in my view, has been winning the new Middle East Cold War. I think both Washington and Riyadh would like to see an Iran that has moved away from potential weaponization of its nuclear program and whose regional influence is constrained. But Washington and Riyadh have profoundly different views of how to achieve that goal. The Obama administration's view, if I read them correctly, is that negotiations with Iran on the nuclear issue can not only, if successful, walk the Iranians back from weaponization, but can also, in the longer term, lead to what Washington would see as a more, quote-unquote, responsible Iranian foreign policy behavior in the region. That's a bet that the Saudis are not willing to make. Well, the Saudis can do very little vis-a-vis the negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran on the nuclear issue. They would say that curtailing Iranian regional influence is as important and as immediately important as the nuclear question, and that they fear that any compromise with Iran that leads to a nuclear deal will give the Iranians a somewhat free hand on the question of regional political influence. Now, there's an extreme version of this strain of thought in the Gulf and a more moderate version, right? The extreme version says that the United States and Iran are going to do a geopolitical deal in which the United States, in essence, shifts alliances in the Middle East, backs Iran as a regional policeman, and throws over its current allies. I think that's a great exaggeration. I think that's a great exaggeration because American policy in this part of the world for 70 years has been fundamentally about not allowing any other power to become dominant there. And I doubt very strongly that any American administration, including this one, is going to turn the keys to the car over to Iran, a country with which the United States doesn't even have diplomatic relations right now. Add on to that the other strong pillar of American Middle East policy, its strong relationship with Israel. Right? The Israelis profoundly see increased Iranian regional influence as threatening to them, and I just don't think that the United States is going to ignore Israeli strategic goals to the extent that this more extreme notion has it. But the more moderate notion, I think, has more to say to it, which is that the United States, in doing a deal with Iran, which I think is possible, I don't want to say probable, but it's certainly possible, on the nuclear front, will free up the Iranians. Will give them more resources because sanctions will be taken off. And that this long-term bet, that a first-step nuclear agreement with Iran will lead to a more moderate Iranian regional policy is in fact wrong. It will in fact lead to an emboldened Iran, strengthened, richer, playing an equally disruptive regional role. So on Iran, the U.S. and the Saudis, I think, share ultimate goals, but have very, very different views on tactics. This plays into Syria, where again, declaratory policy is basically the same. The Saudis want the Bashar al-Assad regime to go. The United States constantly says that Bashar al-Assad must go. The difference here is in priorities. Saudi Arabia just sees the conflict in Syria as a lot more important than the United States does. This comes back to the view about how to prioritize the threat from Iran. For the Saudis, the regional influence threat is just as important, pardon me, just as important, if not more important, in the immediate term as the nuclear threat. For the Americans, the nuclear threat takes prominence, and the Obama administration is not going to make Iranian regional behavior a stumbling block on the way to what it sees as a potentially useful and acceptable nuclear deal with Iran. Finally, on this whole question of the Muslim Brotherhood and more broadly, the future of elected governance, which would have to include Islamist parties in the Arab world. Here, of course, the United States is on the fence. During the uprisings of 2011, the United States was vocally in support of democratic transitions, except maybe in Bahrain, because we have a naval base there. But even in the rhetorical policy, the United States urged political reform rather than the path that the Bahraini government has taken. And of course, in Egypt, the United States, in essence, reversed the decades-long policy of non-communication with the Muslim Brotherhood and was perfectly accepting of a Muslim Brotherhood-elected government. It was nervous about it. It was nervous about the future of the relationship, partially because the Israelis were really nervous, partially because of the tortured history in recent decades of the United States and Islamist politics more generally. But the United States, and particularly the Obama administration, was willing to engage with democratically elected Islamists and see that as a somewhat positive step. That doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. won't engage with the military government in Egypt. It continues to, but it has these misgivings. There are no misgivings, of course, in Saudi Arabia about the course of events in Egypt. Right? They see it as entirely positive. I don't think that Egypt is going to become an immediate point of contention between Saudi Arabia and the U.S. because the U.S. will grudgingly, eventually, despite Senator Leahy, come around to dealing with the Sisi government after Sisi's elected, if he wins. But I think longer term, this is an issue on which the Saudis and the Americans don't share an overarching strategic goal, right? On Iran, I think the strategic goal is the same. Differences in tactics, differences in priorities. But on this issue of democratic governance in the Arab world, which would include democratically elected Islamist governments, I think that the Saudis and the Americans have profoundly different strategic goals. That's not going to lead to a crisis in the relationship anytime soon, but it's going to be a factor that will lead to tensions in the relationship, depending upon how politics develops in the Arab world in the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We're now on to the question and answers, and I see quite a few questions already. For those of you who are new to ISS, the form is you catch my eye, a microphone will come to you, and then when you pose the question, can you begin, please, by saying who you are and what organisations you're from? And because I already see quite a lot of questioners, could you please make your questions as short as possible? And we'll start with the gentleman just on the edge of the front right here.
Mr. Vipul Thakur, IIS member. I got some comments, sir. Saudi Arabia has been important so far due to its oil, resources and wealth. However, its decline and inevitable disintegration in about 40 years has commenced. The Western countries are behind the curve of global realities. Reasons. One, the country is ruled by second generation of House of Saud and few princes could compromise who is the ruler king. Third generation has hundreds and the fourth generation has thousands of princes. There will be factions and fights. Two, by 2017, due to fast increasing non-OPEC oil and gas production with the US energy independence, the price of oil will go down very fast. Saudi Arabian revenue will be reduced by billions. Three, it's an autocratic regime with no public support and it bribes people with money. However, very fast increasing population will need billions of more dollars. It will break even its treasury. The Eastern oil-rich Shia majority region will go on its own way very first time after rebellion and violence. USA, with its focus on Asia Pacific and its energy independence, will not have any desire to get involved. The USA, UK, EU need to review their policies and not give undue importance to a power that has been and is Wahhabi Sunni extremism responsible for most of the global Islamic terrorism implemented through Sunni Pakistan and other countries. Thank you, sir.
There's quite a few points in that, but basically what you're really asking is, are the internal tensions within Saudi Arabia going to destabilize the country? And will this combine with strategic trends in the US, namely the tilt to the Asia Pacific and increasing energy independence?
Yeah. Saudi Arabia has been, the West should look forward to what's going to come, shape of things,
Okay.
and not what it has been.
Well, let's give the professor a chance to respond to that.
Do you want to collect a few, or should I go right in?
That's several questions in themselves.
Indeed.
Thank you.
I'm a little more bullish on the future of Saudi Arabia. You highlight a number of issues that are important. Let me just tick them off. The succession issue. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a serious issue, one that has to go to the next generation. They seem to have kicked the can down the road a bit if, in fact, this designation of Prince Mukran as Crown Prince in waiting, if you will, sticks. If it does, I mean, this generation could have another 10 years. Now, 10 years is not 40 or 50 years, but I have no prophetic skills, and so I don't talk about 50 years down the road. The energy revolution, I think, is grossly exaggerated. I think that Persian Gulf oil is going to continue to be important for decades. When we talk about the supply side increasing, we don't talk about the demand side. I don't know where the demand side is going. All I know is that despite the increased American energy production recently, oil prices are still around $100 a barrel. And the Saudis have over $700 billion in relatively liquid assets. And so they could actually last out a decline in oil prices for quite a while. They did this in the 1980s when oil prices took an enormous dive, right? They basically spent down their own reserves, borrowed money from their own population, learning that from the Americans. They borrowed it from their social insurance fund, which is what America does, besides borrowing from China. And so I think that actually the 10-year prognosis here is not bad for the Saudi regime. It is an autocratic regime, absolutely no question about it, absolutely no question about it. But it's interesting to note that it was the major Arab state least affected by the Arab Spring uprisings. And I think that that is worth noting. Now, is that because everyone is happy in Saudi Arabia? Absolutely not. Right? But I think it is a product of two important factors. Factor number one is that the Saudis have been able to deliver, right? Not to everybody and perhaps not to the extent that people would want on the economic front. But the promise of $130 billion, which the king made in commitments, and many of which he redeemed immediately through increased salaries, I did think reduced the level of discontent. Right? Secondly, the opposition in Saudi Arabia, the potential opposition to the regime is profoundly divided. It's profoundly divided on sectarian grounds. It's profoundly divided on ideological grounds. Unlike in Egypt and Tunisia, right, where various ideological currents could come together and basically unite, behind the slogan that the Shab yurid isqat al-nizam, right? The people want to follow the regime. Right? In Saudi Arabia, potential elements of the opposition are more nervous and more distrustful of each other than they are of the government. That might not be a good thing socially, but it's a good thing if you're a member of the Al Saud. I take the point about Wahhabism, but I think it's a mistake for us to attribute every single manifestation of Salafi extremism in the Muslim world as kind of emanating directly from orders in Riyadh. Right? The rise of Salafism in its various manifestations, I think, is probably the most important element in the Muslim world in the last 3 decades. And we have to understand it in this broader sense. Saudi oil money, the Saudi model, certainly contributed to this rise. But I think it's actually a lot more complicated than that, and so I'm not going to sign on completely to your analysis on that.
Thanks. Can we go to the back, Charlotte? And first of all, there's a gentleman in the aisle with a beard and a white shirt.
Hi, thank you very much. Julian Barnes-Dacey with the European Council on Foreign Relations. Given your take on the Saudis losing this broader Cold War, I wondered what your sense is on any potential prospect down the line of the Saudis actually backing down, particularly in Syria. Is Syria a zero-sum game that they won't step back from? Or given the way that things are playing out, do you foresee a potential down the line where actually the Saudis start thinking the costs are too high in terms of blowback and all of that. And linked to that, just wondered if you had any thoughts on what's happened in Lebanon of late, where the Iranians and the Saudis seem to have struck a deal over the new government. You had the security clampdown seemingly focused more on Sunni militants than Hezbollah, etc. What does that say about Saudi ambitions? You know, does the threat of collapse in Lebanon push them to make a deal?
Take that one?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure. I think that the prospects of a Saudi-Iranian rapprochement should not be discounted. The Saudis know Rouhani as a Rafsanjani protege, and the Saudi elite is comfortable dealing with Rafsanjani. They've dealt with Rouhani before. I think that there is a slight rethinking among some corners of the Saudi elite about the costs of their Syrian policy. I think that the recent backing away of Prince Bandar from the Syrian file, the reports that the Interior Minister, Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, is taking a greater role in the Syrian file, indicate that the Saudis are very aware of the blowback potential. And of course, just recently they criminalized, they criminalized any Saudi going to Syria to join the jihad, right? Which I think is an indication of the seriousness with which they take the blowback thing. One of the small things that seems to have come out of the Obama-Saudi summit of March was perhaps more of an agreement between the Americans and the Saudis about who should get which kinds of weapons. And we see these reports of anti-tank weapons going to what the Americans would say are carefully vetted elements of the Syrian opposition. I think that might be, in the short term, the path that the Saudis and the Americans have worked here to try to support the good guys in the opposition and isolate the bad guys in the Syrian opposition. How successful that will be, I have my doubts about, but I think that that's the path that they've chosen. So what's the big problem in the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement notion? I think there are two problems. One, the Saudis might be able to deal with Rouhani, right? But can Rouhani deal with the other people in Tehran who have a voice in other elements of regional policy outside of the nuclear issue? I have my doubts because, and this is the second element, the Saudis out of a rapprochement with Iran, I think, would expect some dial back of Iranian involvement in the Eastern Arab world. And why would the Iranians give up the geopolitical gains that they've achieved? Why would they give up their influence in Lebanon? Why would they give up on Bashar al-Assad when it appears that he's turned the corner and is stronger? Why would they give up on their newly won influence in Iraq? And I think that that's going to be the real obstacle to a Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. Within Lebanon itself, I don't know the specifics. I would be really interested to see if the Iranians and the Saudis actually have, kind of behind closed doors, done some kind of deal on Lebanon. I mean, as recently as 2007, they were openly cooperating to try to calm things down in Lebanon. So I guess I'm wait and see on Lebanon.
Thank you. And right at the back, Dana Allen from the ISS.
Thank you. Hi, Greg. Thanks. A great talk. You've actually touched on my question with your response to the last one, but you made two statements. One was a sort of burden of your talk, which is that Saudi Arabia is losing this Cold War. The other, which you would think would be the flip side, but it's not entirely clear to me how, is that Iran is winning. And I mean, maybe that should be obvious to me, but in the things you mention, you talk about Syria, Hamas, Lebanon. I mean, this seems like maybe Iran is clawing back to kind of the status quo that I've known for at least for the last 20 years. So what would Iranian victory look like? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Sure.
And I mean, it seems to me that that relates to the Saudi allegation about American fecklessness and naivete as well, if that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Iran's biggest geopolitical gain of the last decade, was not Lebanon or Syria, it was Iraq, right? A country which had attacked Iran in 1980, with which the Iranians had fought a brutal war, with which Iran sees in many ways as a cultural, as part of its cultural and religious, certainly, ambit with the holy cities in Karbala and Najaf. When the United States invaded Iraq and destroyed the Iraqi state, we opened up Iraq as an arena, and the greatest beneficiary of that was Iran. And now Iran is, I think without question, the most influential and important outside player in Iraqi politics. I actually think that if you had the Iranian leadership, locked in a room and said you can only have one, Syria or Iraq, they wouldn't even have to think 2 seconds and say, we'll take Iraq. Right? That's on our borders. It's so much more important to us. But, why give up any gain that you have? Now, I think that in the longer run, it will be very difficult for Iran to digest, let's call it its mini empire. That's an exaggeration, but let's just use that phrase. Its mini empire in the Eastern Arab world. Right? Syria is not a particularly good ally these days. It's a drain on resources. It makes Iran look very bad. It gives the lie to any Iranian effort to kind of jump over the sectarian barrier, the sectarian divide. And supporting the Assad regime, I think, is going to be a costly, long-term endeavor for Iran. Iraq will be very hard to digest. Right? In the current atmosphere where extremist violence from some elements of the Sunni Arab community is back on the rise, it does push Shia groups together, right? But in the longer term, those Shia Iraqi groups are as hostile to each other politically, right, as any allies could possibly be. Maliki has as many problems from the Sadrists and from Ahmad al-Hakim as he does from the Sunnis. And thus, I actually think that, down the road, the Iranians will find managing their mini empire to be a very difficult task, particularly in the context of a domestic political system where back in 2009, during the Green Revolt, there were chants of, no to Palestine, no to Lebanon, only Iran. I don't think that this is a particularly popular foreign policy generally in Iran. So we'll see how it goes. But in the short term, I think if you have to declare a winner in the new Middle East Cold War, it's Iran.
Thanks. Time marches on, and I'll start grouping the questions together in pairs. If you can come to the front, extreme left, Charlotte. There's a gentleman in the second row, and then Mark Fitzpatrick next to him.
Yeah, hi, Jonathan Paris. Great talk, Greg. I'd like to just remind everybody this is the 40th anniversary of the Saudi-led Arab embargo. And back then, it did appear that Saudi Arabia was the uncontested winner. But if you look back, it's been a disappointment, if anything, a bust. And perhaps that is because we've overestimated the importance of economic power without hard power. And I look at Syria as an example of that, where you see Iran and Soleimani, directing real fighters from Hezbollah, from Iraq Shia groups. What is Saudi doing in Lebanon and Syria? So could you just, based on your long experience with Saudi Arabia, make some observations about why some of us, like me, overestimated Saudi power 40 years ago?
And Mark Fitzpatrick.
Thanks. Mark Fitzpatrick, Senior Fellow here at the IISS. A year ago when the Geneva talks were being put together, there was a view among many circles, not just liberal circles, even within some governments in Western countries, that Iran ultimately needs to be brought into this. Iran has been a part of the problem, but could be part of the solution, and after all, they should be brought into it. But the Saudis, just were adamantly opposed to that, and so I think that's probably why there wasn't too much consideration given to that. If there were to be a Saudi-Iran rapprochement, it would probably result in Iran being given a greater regional role. So your idea that, well, rapprochement is difficult because why would Iran give up things? There are things for it to gain. Maybe, to me, the bigger question would be what would induce the Saudis to allow Iran to play a role, and whether you think that it would be useful for Iran to play such a role.
Two questions that are quite related in their way.
Yeah, great. I mean, Jonathan's point about hard power versus soft power, I think, is well, I don't want to say hard power. You didn't use the term soft power. Money is hard power too, right? But I think that you hit the nail on the head of an important difference between the Iranians and the Saudis, right? The Iranians conduct their own foreign policy. Qasem Soleimani has his own guys and has reliable client forces that he can command. Right? The Saudis always have to outsource their foreign policy, right? They have money, right? But once that money leaves their hands, right, they have very little control over the people to whom that money goes because they don't have these long-standing client relationships with them, and they don't have their own equivalent of the Quds Force to put on the ground. So I think that that's absolutely right. A very smart Saudi I know said to me once that the difference between us and the Iranians is they have Qasem Soleimani, right, and we have Salman bin Sultan, right, who was one of the people with Bandar working the Syria file. And I don't know if he meant that personally, but I took that structurally, right? That Qasem Soleimani has people at his disposal, right? Fighters at his disposal whom he commands, in essence. And the Saudis don't have any of that. And I think that that's in a hard power situation like a civil war, that's a great advantage. I think, parenthetically, that also explains the problems the Turks have had in Syria, right? Because Turkey's kind of the rise of Turkey, right, in the region was almost exclusively a soft power rise, right? We're a model, right, of elected Islamist government and great economic success. Our soap operas are viewed all over the Arab world. Turkey is a great vacation destination. Turkish business is, right? I mean, and this is, I mean, if we had gotten together in 2010 and we'd had a show of hands, who's the rising power in the Middle East today? I think a majority of people would have said Turkey, right? But when it comes to a civil war, and Erdogan thought that soft power would allow him to play into Syria. No, hard power is what counts. Saudi money is more important than Turkish soft power, right? And the Turks are Turks have hard power, right? The best army up there, you know, with setting the Israelis aside, but they're unwilling to use it, right, for all sorts of political reasons. Mark, I think that bringing the Iranians into a Syrian negotiation would only be a recognition of reality. I don't think that the Iranians would be willing to pay a single rial for that right, because they say, well, go ahead and try to do a deal on Syria without us. See if it works, right? And so I don't see them as being kind of champing at the bit to be invited to Geneva. And I don't see them as willing to kind of give anything in order to join that club. I think they're perfectly happy to wait for everybody from Geneva to come to them. So what would induce the Saudis to give up their strong opposition to including the Iranians in the Geneva process? I think that it would require a change of view in Saudi Arabia regarding the priority of threats, right? and it would require a willingness to at least partially buy into the American notion that strengthening Rouhani will lead to good results down the line. I'm not sure the Saudis are willing to do that, but the fact that they've opened this second front vis-a-vis the Muslim Brothers in recent months makes me think that maybe there's a rethinking about priority of threats that might lead, in conjunction with some behind-the-scenes diplomacy with Iran, to at least a lessening of the absolute hostility. And we'll see.
Okay. In the middle of the left-hand block shot, there's a gentleman with a check jacket.
Thank you very much. Hosni Imam, journalist. We are always fascinated by the Western analysis of what's going on in the Middle East.
I'm always fascinated by the Middle Eastern analysis.
The
of
Middle
what's going
East
on in
is
the Middle
not
East.
Switzerland, it's not
Yeah.
Sweden,
Yeah.
it's not the United States. And in your very esteemed assessment, you have actually ignored the will, say, of the Egyptian people, the will of the Gulf people to come together with Egypt out of sheer history and shared common goals. In the meantime, you also ignored the fact that that toxic mix between religion and politics is very dangerous, and you don't have this kind of example. In Germany has a Christian Democrat, but it is just in name, but Muslim Brothers is something else. You ignored completely the violent history of the Muslim Brothers. You actually ignored also the terrorism which is going on in Egypt and its impact, not only in Egypt, on the region. The United States and Egypt have very common shared interests in fighting terrorism, and the whole region. Your ally, your main ally, Israel, is also would be very concerned about what is going on in Sinai if Egypt is putting its hands behind its back and doing nothing. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll take that as a statement. Doubtless the professor will react to that. And there's a gentleman in a courted jacket here in the front of the left-hand row.
Hi, George Lambrakis, a former diplomat, American diplomat in the Middle East as well as elsewhere. I've been trying very hard to see if there's anything you say that I don't agree with. It's been terrific as far as foreign policy goes. However, I think the previous questioner really fits into what I was going to say, which is, in the case of Iran, let's not forget the domestic situation there. You know, you're assuming that Rouhani is there forever. He either will be there more than he is now or less. He's not going to stay at the same level where he's kind of playing but not quite in charge of anything. And if you look at what is happening in the Arab world in general, we shouldn't really rule out the public. The fact that there was this Arab Spring means something. It's not gone forever. And while I can't disagree on any of your foreign policy and other Saudi and other things, I have to raise that question.
Two very closely related points. And I recall what Emil Kaim, one of our experts of ISS Middle East, has said. If you want to summarize the Arab Spring in a single sentence, it's the people have become an actor again. Professor?
Right. Ustaz Husni, I take your points about the interpretation of the current political trajectory in Egypt, and I certainly think that in the end, your points about the commonality of interests vis-a-vis the peace treaty with Israel, vis-a-vis counterterrorism issues will push the American government and the Egyptian government together. I don't disagree with that. I do think that there is a longer-term issue in terms of how important, and this is more of a question for the United States than it is a question for countries in the Middle East. How important is American democracy rhetoric in our actual policy? Right? And that's a question that the United States has never really confronted on the Middle East, because for most of the post-Cold War period, and even at the end of the Cold War itself, democratic reforms basically brought to power pro-American governments. Whether it was in Latin America in the 80s and 90s with the adoption of neoliberal economic policies by newly democratic governments in many cases, whether it was East Asia, where democratic changes in South Korea, Taiwan, didn't at all harm the American relationship with these countries. And of course, Eastern Europe, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, where democratic reform and pro-Americanism went hand in hand. That's never been the case in the Middle East, right? Democratic governance in the Middle East will, at least on first elections, bring to power groups, usually Islamist groups, who are very suspicious of the United States. So this is a question for Washington more than it is for the region, how important is real democratic reform to American interests? And I don't think that any administration has solved that question. Without a doubt, the public has become an actor. But I think it's a mistake for us to think that the enormous enthusiasm of 2011 is easily replicable. I think most people in the Arab world would right now say that in general, not much good has come of the uprisings of 2011. I think folks in Tunisia would, maybe take exception. But other than that, it's hard to point at a success story in the genuine popular mobilizations against decades of corrupt authoritarian rule. And so I take your point completely that the things that will surprise us and the things that will turn, right, the analytical path another direction will be unforeseen domestic events. Maybe in Iran, maybe elsewhere, right? But I'm not signing on to the idea that the Arab uprisings of 2011 are going to be a constant thing. Here's the thing that I do think has changed. I doubt very strongly that you can get 30 years of stable authoritarian governance the way you did under Mubarak in a place like Egypt. I don't think General Sisi has that long before he has to show some progress on things.
Okay, thanks. We're almost out of time, but I'd like to take a final two questions. The gentleman on the front right side of the left-hand row here. Could you please keep your remarks as brief as possible?
Chair, Asian and Pacific Affairs. Professor Goss, if you could educate me a bit. If there is any probably implicit understanding and exchange between the two closest allies of the U.S., Israel and Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
And a gentleman on the right-hand side of the aisle in a green tie and glasses. Just walk past him, Charlotte. There we are. Thank you.
Ted C. with the British American Security Information Council here in London. Given your view, Professor, that the regional potential of Iran is of more concern to the Saudis than, at the moment, the nuclear program, do you see any circumstances under which the Saudis would agree to a nuclear sharing arrangement with, say, Pakistan, up to and including an extended deterrent from Pakistan on Saudi soil?
Thanks for two commendably brief questions.
Yes, very good. Israel and Saudi, it's undoubtedly true that elites of both countries have had meetings. I think that the most important thing to note from those meetings is that on the Saudi side, they are constantly and vehemently denied. And the fact that there is no elite and certainly no popular acceptance of an open relationship with Israel, despite many strategic commonalities or common views, I think is indicative of the obstacles in Saudi to this, right? Saudi foreign policy is not governed by Saudi public opinion, but I think there are some red lines that the Saudi leadership is very reluctant to cross. One of them is an open relationship with Israel. I think that that's not just a fear of popular reaction. I think it's also a deeply held view among many in the elite that Israel is, in the long term, a cause of many problems to them and not something that they necessarily want to have open relations with. I was struck by, last time I was in Saudi in January, there was a big exhibit about King Faisal. And they actually had some tape recording, some television, actually, video of some of his speeches. And I'd never seen him speak. So I sat down and I watched some of these speeches. Faisal's the most important modern king of Saudi Arabia. He was profoundly anti-Israeli. And I think that view is something that is held by a number of the elites in Saudi Arabia as well. So you might see these feelings out behind closed doors, but I don't think it will ever extend to anything beyond the most tactical, short-term cooperation on much of anything.
Not even against Iraq, sorry. Not even against Iraq.
No, I don't think so. This is, as they used to say in the States, the $64,000 question. We know from the WikiLeaks and from memoirs and from talking to Saudis that they are holding out the possibility of if Iran weaponizes, that they will somehow acquire a deterrent capacity. They are very they're not very detailed in what that means. Right? They certainly have done very, very little domestically to try to build an indigenous nuclear capability. And it's not because they don't have the money. Right? The UAE is ahead of them on domestic nuclear energy development. They have great plans on the books, but they don't seem to move very quickly. So it can't be an indigenous capability. And thus, everyone looks to Pakistan. Now, I don't know anything about Pakistan, so I'm not going to comment on that. But it does seem to me to be jumping the gun to think that the Pakistanis would just produce nuclear warheads for Saudi Arabia and give them to them. I'll leave it to people who know Pakistan better. Now, the Saudis have a long relationship with Pakistan, with both the government of Pakistan and with the military in Pakistan. Nawaz Sharif, the prime minister, spent his exile in Saudi Arabia. Right? Benazir Bhutto spent hers in Dubai. Right? Nawaz spent his in Saudi Arabia. But I am just not confident that this, kind of is an automatic snap your fingers and, voila, there's a Pakistani supply of nuclear warheads to Saudi Arabia. Now, if the Pakistanis say, our missiles, our nuclear force is a deterrent to attack on Saudi Arabia, we don't have to give you warheads. We don't have to station our own nuclear forces in Saudi Arabia. We are a deterrent to you from Pakistan. Those are nice words, but I mean, if I'm a Saudi, do I want to put at risk my American nuclear umbrella for a Pakistani one at distance that I don't control? I think that's a difficult question for the Saudis.
Thank you for that. And if I may, could I, for those of you who are interested in this particularly difficult question, could I commend to you some of the work ISS has done on the question of Pakistan's nuclear file, a dossier on AQ Khan's nuclear black market, an essay on the topic in last September's Strategic Survey, and also Mark Fitzpatrick's book, which he recently launched on Pakistan's nuclear capability and how it could be made safer for the world as a whole. Professor, thank you very much indeed. I mean, Saudi Arabia is central to the region in many ways. It's geographically central, its wealth makes it central, and we shouldn't forget, of course, that on its soil are the two holy places, which amplifies its influence in the Muslim world. And I think we've had no better analysis of this from a Saudi point of view, from the point of view of the desk of the important people in Riyadh who are grappling with these issues from a Saudi government point of view. So would you please join with me in expressing your appreciation for an excellent talk?